Thanks for joining us this morning. We had some excellent sessions so far, and we're going to close things off with a final session with Dr. Juli Carrillo from University of British Columbia. She's going to be talking about pests and pollinators and looking at some of this flood and extreme heat impacts and how that's specifically impacting pests and pollinators. So thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Juli Carrillo, and for making this session happen. So we can see your screen, so you can go ahead.
All right, great. Thank you, Shauna. Let me just go ahead and hide that. Yeah, so thanks everyone for sticking with us for the last session. Feel free to post your questions in the chat throughout, and I'll stop midway to answer some questions as well. I wanted to start with a land acknowledgement. I'm joining today from the traditional ancestral and unceded territory from the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations out near UBC. But the observations I'm sharing today come from a wider Coast Salish area in BC, including the territories of the Katzie, Stolo, and the Sumas First Nations. So as we talk about changing climate and the flood of the Sumas Prairie reaching the previous levels of Sumas Lake and the flood of the Nooksack River, which is shown here, it's a reminder of the interconnectedness of the land, people, and all who share the space and our shared responsibility for it. And just recognizing also that these natural events or disasters with changing climate don't recognize borders and can affect us all. So this is showing the Nooksack River from Washington State, flooding its banks into BC. So this flood was a life-altering event for those that experienced it. The loss of life, the loss of livestock, damage to crops, homes, schools, it was catastrophic. For background, for those of you who are maybe from outside of BC, a powerful atmospheric river made landfall in BC on November 14th and 15th in 2021, leading to catastrophic floods. This shows the Sumas Prairie, which is just completely flooded. We saw the information from Eric about how some of these floods went, 3 weeks, anywhere from a little bit of water to being inundated for weeks. And this flood led to catastrophic landslides as well, and movement of big areas of the soil. So these atmospheric river events of this magnitude are approximately 1 in every 10-year events in the current climate for this region. But it's estimated that they've been made at least 60% more likely by the effects of human-induced climate change. So although we're talking about extreme weather events today, a lot of this has to do with ongoing changing climate. And because a lot of the work from my research group is collaborative with berry growers, we recognize many of the names of the farmers whose fields were flooded. We could put a face to the damage, and I think I can speak for everyone kind of out here on the peninsula at UBC, that we were really feeling for the growers and the people that were affected. Something that we wanted to know right away was how this, whether this flood event could impact spotted wing Drosophila levels. So could there be a potential silver lining for growers if spotted wing was knocked back by the flood? For those of you who are not familiar with spotted wing is a fruit fly that has a serrated ovipositor, and it's one of the major berry pests, probably the primary berry pest in this region and the Pacific Northwest, and a global pest. The female has that serrated ovipositor, so she can lay her eggs in ripening fruit while they're still on the vine. This shows in blueberries kind of the progression of berries after they've had an egg laid inside of them. So the berries slowly start to disintegrate, become mushy. And of course, the economic threshold for having spotted wing larvae in fruit, so having the little maggots in the fruit, is very low. So an entire shipment can be rejected if spotted wing is detected. So spotted wing attacks a wide range of crops. Here in BC, the crops that we're primarily concerned with are the berries, so the blueberries, raspberries, strawberries. But also in the Okanagan and other regions, we experience spotted wing in cherries, potentially future worries with grapes, with this and other pests, and with stone fruits as well. So how could flooding impact berry pest, which you might imagine, like berry pests are mobile. So how is it that this flooding could impact them? Well, floodwaters can kill insect kill insects directly. So they could drown in the flood, the debris, or the turbulence. With the rains, insects can often be knocked off of whatever plant they're on. And for insects that are in their overwintering stage or at different life stages, they could become more vulnerable. So you could imagine an egg in the soil, or a larvae, which is like for spotted wing, the little maggots, or the pupae, which is the cocoon of the insect. Any of these things that are on the ground or in the soil can be directly killed by floodwaters. Floodwaters can also wash away insects in some locations and move them to others. So this was similar to what Eric was referring to with weed seeds. So floodwaters can take insects in kind of these encapsulated forms if their pupal cases are water resistant, or if their eggs are encapsulated, and move them to locations downstream from the flood. So the growers that are experiencing all the debris in their fields may have had some insects wash into their fields. And the floodwaters can also kill crops or make them unsuitable for pests. So as all those berries baked on the vine and cooked on the vine, it's possible also that that killed the insect pest within the berries. We don't really have data on that for this year, but something to look for in future years, and in future when we see these temperature extremes, to sample those berries for spotted wing. I'd be very interested to know whether any of the IPM folks looked at berry numbers in those damaged berries. And then rain can damage flowers and other resources for beneficial insects, including pest predators. So the things that will eat berry pests, often they rely on floral nectar or pollen, or just the habitat from floral resources. And so rain can definitely knock those flowers off the bush or off of the alley crops, and making it less hospitable for those beneficial insects. And then mudslides and flood damage can reduce habitat. And this is both for the pests themselves, but also for those beneficial insects. So anything that's nesting in the ground. So if you think about pollinators, again, these kind of mud sheets make it very difficult for them to survive below ground. And then something that we may see is that flood adapted insects can proliferate in these areas. And so in BC, it's likely that we don't have very many insects that are adapted to flooding conditions that are also in the crop fields, but in other areas, this certainly is the case. So throughout the Southeast US and in other places, you'll often have fire ants, which are able to form these flotillas on top of floodwater. So this is just a huge mat of ants. The queen is somewhere in the center being protected, and the workers are protecting the offspring and the brood, and they can float for long distances and survive on floodwaters. Very kind of terrifying if you run into these in floodwaters, because they'll often try to climb to higher ground, and they're called fire ants because their sting feels like fire. Potentially even scarier example of flood adapted insects. This is in Australia. So those little insects that you can kind of see, there's a big cricket, but most of those are spiders that are trying to escape from the flood. So you'll often see this phenomenon where the small arthropods or insects are fleeing the floodwaters the same as the people, and they will escape in large quantities to higher ground. So there have been some experiments on how floodwaters influence insects. So the University of Oklahoma Biological Station, which is pictured here, experienced a once-in-a-century flood in 2015. So they had previously measured insects on site using pitfall traps, which are just basically a cup in the ground that insects fall into. They measured it again after the flood. And what they found is that of the 7 groups of insects that they measured, most decreased or were completely absent after about a month underwater. So these floodwaters just went through and decimated all the insects that were living terrestrially on the ground. Importantly, the isopods, so like the little roly-polies or the millipedes, which play key roles in decomposition and nutrient cycling in the soil, had not yet returned to this site even 9 months after the flood. So these are potentially big effects where some of the fields were flooded for up to a month, to see how these important decomposers, whether they're able to recolonize these fields, and whether they still are able to assist in nutrient cycling when they come back. What the researchers did find was an increase in these large-bodied groups that are adapted to returning to disturbed areas like field crickets, spiders, and beetles. So not all insect groups were at lower numbers. So we wanted to know about flying insects, which is something that they hadn't looked at, because flying insects can, we may think, could escape the flood, and then they're able to invade fields by flying back into them. We asked this with spotted wing Drosophila, which you can see here, and its natural enemies, which is this parasitoid wasp. So the parasitoid wasps will lay their eggs inside the bodies of spotted wing larvae when they're inside the fruit. And so those larvae will not develop into flies, and they develop into parasitoids instead. So they're one potential mechanism which we may see some control of spotted wing populations in the future, although we don't yet know what control they might have. Spotted wing is not a completely aerial insect for its life. So this is the life cycle of spotted wing. It starts out as an adult. It lays its egg inside the fruit, where it develops into these 3 larval stages, and then eventually it will drop out of that fruit and pupate either on the surface of the soil or a little bit below the soil. So the life stage that we thought would be most vulnerable to flooding would be these pupal cases. Now, this flood event took place in November, and we do see spotted wing levels very high throughout the end of the growing season. That's because of the Himalayan blackberry that's present. That just is a huge food resource, through August and September. And I should mention that this work was done by some very talented folks in my lab: Grace Wang, who's an undergraduate researcher, Dr. Pierre Giraud, who's a postdoctoral researcher, and my lab manager, Martina Clausen. They also wanted to know about how flooding could impact the parasitoids. So this additional life cycle shows how parasitoids lay their eggs inside the larvae. It then develops. And so Grace took these parasitized pupae and also put them in flooding conditions to see if they could survive. So what the experiment looked like, it was done in a laboratory. We had 3 flooding conditions: kind of our moist soil, which is just the control, of flooded soil, and then submerged. And so we submerged the pupae underneath the surface of the water, because otherwise they'll float on top. So we did want to let them float like they might do kind of naturally, or be submerged if they were stuck under debris. And then we flooded these pupae for either 24 hours or 120 hours, which is 5 days. What we found was good news, is that flooding reduced the emergence of spotted wing Drosophila kind of across the 1 day to 5 day period. If you look at the controls, we had 136 spotted wing emerge from these pupal cases, which you can see in the picture, whereas if they were floating or submerged, we had much fewer. So this is out of 200, so 136 out of 200 survived in the controls, whereas in the floating and submerged, you have substantially lower numbers. For the parasitoids, though, so when we looked at these, we saw similar declines. We only have 24-hour data at this point. Grace is currently waiting for the next 4 days to get the parasitoids after 120 hours. So we have fewer parasitoids emerging overall after 24 hours, but of the ones that are emerging, they're definitely emerging in the controls, also some in the floating conditions where the pupae can float on top, but if they're submerged underwater, it does reduce their emergence. So both the spotted wing and its natural enemy are susceptible to these floodwaters. So our take-home message from that experiment is that even as little as 24 hours of flooding reduced spotted wing Drosophila emergence. So not that this means that growers should go out and flood their fields, because we found that parasitoid emergence was also reduced, and we don't know, what inference we can draw from this lab experiment to evaluate field data. So even though potentially local population levels were knocked back by the flood, at this point, we don't know how likely it is for adjacent populations to reinvade those fields. So that's something that we need to look at in this year and in the coming years. I wanted to also talk about some other data from Dr. Renee Prasad, who's a professor at University of Fraser Valley. She shared some slides with me. This was the article that Eric mentioned. So she does a lot of work out in the flooded area, looking at kind of insect pests in these areas, not so much in berry crops, but in vegetable crops. However, I think the takeaways can be shared across the groups. So because the flooding happened when most species would have been overwintering, so independent of spotted wing, which was still out and about, there could have been other berry pests or other pest insects that are overwintering. And it depends on whether the floodwaters would impact that stage, whether you would have seen a negative decline. And so Renee looked at cabbage root maggots. She collected pupae from cole crops in 2 fields. One of the fields was flooded, one of the fields was not flooded. And then she looked at emergence of these cabbage roots, maggots over between those 2 fields. And so these are the data. The blue is the flooded field, the orange is the non-flooded field. So there's potentially, a few more that are emerged from the non-flooded field, but in general, these are pretty similar to one another. Doesn't seem like there's a huge negative effect of flooding on these insects, but this is preliminary. So we're excited to hear more from Renee, and I think she'll be presenting these results once they get more data. So I just wanted to pause because that kind of marks the end of what I have for flood data for spotted wing, the parasitoids, and maybe for some of these other insect classes, to see if anybody has any questions about the flood, potential effects of flooding on pest insects or other insects. And if not, then I will move on to heat dome impacts on berry pests.
Yeah, this is a great time to take a little pause. So if you have a question, feel free to put it into the chat or the Q&A, and we can ask it now. There will, of course, be more time for questions at the end. But really interesting to see. Obviously there's massive impacts of this kind of catastrophic flooding. So really interesting to see some of those lab experiments. Yeah, so I don't think there are any questions at the moment. So yeah, maybe you can continue. Actually, maybe one question I will ask just myself. So, you've done these lab trials of trying to recreate those flooding conditions and see what the impacts would be. And does your team or your lab, are you doing some in-field monitoring this season to see sort of the real world impacts of how the pest and pollinator populations have changed in the field in those flood impacted areas?
Yeah, so we don't work too much in the flood impacted areas at this stage, although we're looking to work in that area in the future as part of a new funded project we have, particularly for growers who are interested in putting cover crops in between the alleys of their blueberries. We are very interested to see how this may influence pest and pollinators. Right now, most of our field sites are in Delta, where we had some flooding, but definitely not to the same extent. And then we do kind of ongoing monitoring at UBC Farm. I'll talk at the end if growers want to participate in some of our monitoring, although we wouldn't look necessarily in the fields, like in the soil. We would look kind of at sticky card levels of their spotted wings throughout the season. So if growers are interested in participating in that and they're in the flooded region, we're definitely interested in connecting.
Great, thanks for that added info. And if there are others that are on the webinar, from the Ministry of Agriculture or growers that are monitoring, it'd be great to throw a comment in the chat if that's something that you're looking at this year. Okay, so Juli, take it away. Let's talk about the heat dome impacts.
Thanks, Shauna. So just to give you some background, there was a heat dome in BC and the Pacific Northwest and the western kind of coast of the US and Canada in the summer of 2021. So this was between June 25th and July 1st was the high temperature. So I'm really going to focus on that window of time. And that was when we had this heat dome, which was a high pressure weather system that trapped heat in the area with record high temperatures across the province. some areas reaching up to 49.6 degrees Celsius. So again, a catastrophic event for human life and for livestock and potentially for insects as well. So we wanted to know whether we would see any sort of impact on berry pests and beneficial insects. We know that extreme heat can kill insects directly. They essentially cook too if it's too hot and they're not adapted to it. We know that insect body temperature relies on environmental temperature because of the metabolism of insects and the way their bodies work. So if it's warm outside, insects are warm. If it's cold outside, insects are cold. They're not really generating much body heat on their own, which is why you'll see them not moving when it's cold, and their movement increases as it gets warmer. The other thing temperature does is it drives development. So when we get warmer temperatures, we have faster development of insects. So that means you can have more generations within a year or within a growing season when overall temperature is increased. And this can be really important for both pest populations going into the end of the season, which determines how big the pest population is at the beginning of the next season. And then something kind of longer term is to think about range expansion, that as climate warms, many of these insects are moving their ranges further north. And so this will be something we've already detected spotted wing kind of in the central coast of BC. Not so much a berry growing region there, but where there are native berries that are important for many of the indigenous First Nations there, we do see spotted wing kind of in those areas, and just in general in Canada, we could imagine a range expansion of not just berry pests, but other pest insects as well. And then something that can happen with changing climate is there can be ecological mismatches. So perhaps the insects are changing, but the plants aren't changing fast enough. So you might think about this with pollinators, where the bees really have to come out, or other pollinators need to be present when their host plants are present. And so as temperature changes and perhaps it impacts generation time of plants and insects differently, you could have what's called phenological mismatches, or mismatches in timing. So these missed connections that can have important ecosystem effects. So we've been doing all sorts of insect monitoring, primarily at UBC Farm. We've been focused on spotted wing Drosophila monitoring in a variety of crops and in hedgerows, so in blueberries and in strawberries, and then looking at some of these floral intercrops or cover crops that can be used to support parasitoids and other natural enemies of blueberries and support pollinators. So this is UBC Farm, located out at the tip of the peninsula. Our closest neighbors are the Musqueam First Nation. And it's just a lovely place to be in the middle of the city. We do monitoring across the edges of these fields and within the production fields themselves. So the blue is the blueberry fields, and then the red kind of strips are where we have strawberries. Those strawberries change, depending on the year and when we're putting in new plots or not. And then you can see we sample in all the hedgerows and forest. So looking at our spotted wing Drosophila data, this shows 4 years of data. You can't really see what's happening early in the season. Some of it is because the numbers are zero, but mostly it's because the numbers are very low compared to late season. And so we are sampling just thousands and thousands of spotted wing between September and November. And the way we sample them is by using these apple cider vinegar traps, where spotted wing is attracted to the odor of the vinegar. It's similar to ripening fruit and rotting fruit. They go into these traps, and then folks in my lab, Grace Wang, who was involved in the previous project, go through and count the spotted wing and count the other insects as well. So if you look at the end of these years, the heat dome year is 2021, so it's in yellow in this graph. And it's by the end of the year, they have similar numbers as you might see in 2020 or 2019. So very similar to 2019, maybe a little bit lower than 2020. What we wanted to do is kind of zoom in on what's happening in these kind of earlier season, just because it's so hard to see because of the huge numbers we see end of season. And this shows data that were collected for the week ending the 25th of June. So this was the week prior to the heat dome, the week during the heat dome, and then the week after the heat dome. 2019 is the blue dashed line, 2020 is the yellow dashed line, and then 2021, the heat dome, is the red line. So the heat dome, 2021 in general is kind of middle of the pack here. It has more insects than 2020, not as many as 2019. But what I want you to focus on is the slope coming from the middle date down to that end date. And so, you know, when you're thinking about population growth, so you're seeing an increase for the yellow and the blue line, but for the red line, you're seeing a small decrease in that. And so we did see a small decline in spotted wing Drosophila trap numbers during the heat dome. But, you know, if you go back to this, it's not clear how that translates to end of season numbers. What we really wanted to do is look at how it looks for this year. So those end of season numbers really drive the early season numbers, that in combination with the winter temperatures we have. And so, sorry, the colors have changed around from each of these graphs. But 2022 is this year, it's the green, it's all the way at the bottom. You can see the numbers are quite depressed compared to our other early season year. So 2020, we started out with, you know, over 400 insects in the trap. And then this year we have less than 100, looks like, you know, maybe 30 or so in April. So this is potentially good news if what we're seeing at UBC Farm is similar to what we might expect to see at other fields in the area. I'm really interested to know what we'll see in our Delta fields to see whether we have similar low numbers for 2022. It does seem like potentially this is a lower start or a slower start to the year than previous years. Although we do have parasitoid data, we don't yet have it analyzed, so you'll have to, that will be a TBD, to be determined. This is a nice picture of a parasitoid attacking a larvae inside a raspberry fruit, just so you can see what it is. This is a photo taken by Warren Wong, a PhD student in the lab. He's also working on strawberry blossom weevil monitoring, which is another pest of berries. And Rosaceae, plants in the Rosaceae family. He's working with Dr. Michelle Franklin at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. And we're not sure yet what their data show on the heat dome effects on strawberry blossom weevil, but that's something to look forward to hearing about later in the season as well. And then click beetles. So click beetles or wireworms are not a big pest for berries. They can feed on tubers and roots, and so they're primarily a pest of potatoes and carrots and root vegetables. But since we do have data on them, I wanted to present it. And what we see is pretty much there's no detectable heat wave effect on click beetles. They seem pretty resilient to the heat dome and temperatures, although we do see a big decrease in the red line. You know, after the heat wave, the total numbers started out higher, but they're ending in around the same place. And so even though there's potentially an effect, because of the variability across years, it may be hard to say, you know, is this just typical variability that we would see, or is this a true effect of the heat dome? So we're going to try to dig into that a bit more to see what can we detect statistically for the heat wave effect on these different groups. And then this shows the end of season when we stop monitoring click beetles. You can actually see 2021, the click beetles are doing much better than 2020. So even if there was an effect by the end of the season, it doesn't seem to really have made a difference for them. So some insects seem to be unaffected, whereas others may have a small decline. So I wanted to quickly talk about another project. So this refers to work that we're doing with Delta Farmland Wildlife Trust, looking at beneficial insects and pollinator diversities with different habitat amendments. This is work that's done in collaboration with the Works Lab or Claire Crimmins group, and that we've been doing collaboratively with blueberry growers and other growers in Delta, BC. The two students on the project are Matthew Saruda, who's a master's student in my lab, and Carly McGregor, who was a master's student in Claire Crimmins' lab. She's now my new lab manager, so feel free to reach out and say hello. All of their field sites that they looked at were located in Delta, BC. You can see the inset here. And they were evaluating how these different habitat amendments, so either just plain field margins or different set-asides adjacent to crops or hedgerows, would influence pest and beneficial insect abundance. So that data is super interesting. I'm not going to get into all of it right now. I'm only going to focus on the heat dome effects And this is the average across kind of all of these sites on total insects. So if you look in that cup down at the bottom, that's a pitfall trap. So the student, Matt Saruta, looked at pitfall traps, sticky traps. He vacuumed up the bugs from the bushes using an entomological tool called the bug vacuum. And what he found is that for all the insects he sampled, so these are the total number of arthropods, either before, during, or after the heat wave, is that there seems to be little effect on the total insect number. So it's likely that some are increasing, some are decreasing, but overall, the abundance of insects are staying pretty consistent across these time periods. We really wanted to know what was going on with the pollinators though. So bumblebees are critically important for blueberry production. They're also important for other berry production and just for ecosystem services in general. They buzz pollinate, and so it's a much more effective pollination than honeybees. And so they can work in synergy with honeybees to increase yield. And they are just a great natural resource for growers in general. So we wanted to know whether there's an effect of the heat wave on these bumblebees. And so the way we do this is we go out and we sample bumblebees, so often with a net or a vial. The bumblebees get chilled and we ID them, and then they either most of them get released back into the environment, some are kept for identification. And so this was work that was done by Carly McGregor. And what she found, kind of looking at these two time periods, either May to June 24th, which is the pre-heat dome, and then June 25th to August, which is the post-heat dome, for 2 years. And what you need to, there are two things you can kind of see in this is one, 2020 had more pollinators, period. So both of the time periods for 2020, kind of the yellowish brown bars, there were more pollinators. So this is bumblebees, flies, those sorts of pollinators. We see an increase in 2020 from May to that June period. However, when we look to 2021, numbers are low overall. And that increase that we would expect to see late season just isn't materializing. And so they're not able to really bring those populations up. So why were pollinators so low in 2021? So Carly thinks a lot of it has to do with limited flowers for pollination. So there were several spring rain events that knocked flowers, not just off the crops, but also in the surrounding vegetation. So she did the sampling in these pollinator grassland set-asides that had plants that were kind of chosen for pollinators, and there just were very few flowering plants within these areas in 2021. The other thing that we're seeing from that year is that at least this year, there are anecdotal reports from several researchers that these early season bumblebees are smaller than normal. So it could be that the limited flowers, the heat dome, the flooding, all has exacerbated kind of pollinator health. That being said, pollinators are out right now. They're enjoying the nectar flows. They're very active. We're still catching tons of bumblebees. So it's not all doom and gloom. Like they're still out and about and they're pollinating. They're in the blueberry fields. The honeybees seem to be doing really well too, but it's unclear how flooding has impacted those bumblebees within that region. And so I just want to mention that. So this is a picture of a bumblebee queen. She's nesting. So all bumblebee queens are nesting below ground. They dig these burrows, or they use burrows that were previously excavated by like mice or other rodents, and they nest in these burrows. So you could imagine how a flood event could just completely decimate these colonies because they're stuck in the ground. Any of the offspring are flooded and drowned. The queens themselves are potentially drowned, or if they have to find new places to nest, the region of flooding was quite large, and perhaps other habitat is already taken. And so this is potentially a large effect, which we think it's really important to look at these flooded fields to look at potential effects on pollination. Okay, so we've talked about flooding, we've talked about heat domes, and I want to talk about one other thing about climate change before wrapping up. And it's something that we don't generally think about for crop pests, but it's elevated CO2. So as the planet is warming, part of what's causing this is increases in atmospheric CO2 due to human activities. And there's evidence in other systems, such as in soybean, that elevated CO2 in the atmosphere increases crop susceptibility to pest damage. So I'm not going to get too much into the mechanisms of how this happens. It can be both through nutritional changes in the plant. So they have increased carbohydrates and less protein potentially. So nutritionally, the insects have to eat more of the plant in order to even live. And so that's one reason the damage may be high, but it's also changes in plant natural defenses due to changes in the hormonal signaling pathway. So that's the part I'm not going to get too much into. I just want to present some data that's being collected by a student in the lab, Jimmy Ha, and this work is Jimmy's PhD work. He's been looking at CO2 and crop susceptibility to pest damage. He's using the model system of tomato and chewing herbivores, but really these results can be applied to other crops as well. And I should mention two other people who have been working with Jimmy on this, Dr. Di Wu, and also an undergrad student in my lab, Dennis Chu. But Jimmy has really been leading this work. And what he found by looking at how tomatoes are susceptible to these different types of insects is that CO2 will increase the performance for one caterpillar species only. And so that's the cabbage looper on the left, the tobacco hornworm on the left. That elevated CO2, these caterpillars did better at elevated CO2, but for the other insects, they did not do as well. And so there's pretty variable effects of elevated CO2 depending on the species that you're looking at, which, it would be nice if there was a very broad take home, like it always increases susceptibility of plants or it always increases resistance of plants. But of course, that's not the way it works. What does seem to be pretty consistent is that elevated CO2 increases plant susceptibility to aphids. So this is really something for berry growers to be aware of, that as we get increasing atmospheric CO2, that these phloem feeding insects may become more abundant. All right, so we're at the end. The take home messages. Climate is changing and becoming more extreme. From our results, we see that flooding may have knocked back spotted wing populations. However, the high dispersal ability may mean adults will likely be able to reinvade fields. Further research is needed on this. Pollinators, particularly ground nesting bumblebees, may have longer negative term impacts because of changes to their habitat. And then elevated CO2 and changing climate has variable effects on pests. Some do better, some do worse. It's important to have kind of regional context for these results. And then finally, to end with some management recommendations, I really only have two. One, keep monitoring those pest populations. It may be that thresholds may not be reached until later in the season if the populations are knocked back, which would be a good thing. It would save on some potential sprays. And then the big one is to support pollinators. So for the growers that are planting cover crops, plant flowering cover crops, plant alley crops that provide some resources for pollinators and for natural enemies, and protect nesting sites on the ground. So leave some areas that are not tilled and that are undisturbed. And then just a little plug for what's up next. So we've been working in my group on developing some high-tech insect monitoring tools. There's been a couple popular news articles about it recently. Basically, we're using a sticky card system with a camera to track insects through space and time. And we use machine learning and artificial intelligence to ID insects on these sticky cards. You may have heard about me talk about the Sticky Pie project before. We're interested in deploying these across a wider region in BC and Canada this year. So looking for collaborators for that and for growers who are interested in having some more real-time data collected on spotted wing and other insects in their field. So I'll end with that, and lots of people to acknowledge and funding to acknowledge, especially Genome BC and the BC Blueberries, Strawberries, and Raspberry councils, and lots of people who worked on it. But I will stop there for questions.
Thank you so much for such an interesting presentation. You covered a lot of ground there, but it's yeah, really fascinating research and multifaceted. So we do have time for questions. So again, you can type them into the Q&A. Other speakers, if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand, and you can also ask questions. You're not able to type them into the Q&A, but you can ask them directly. While the participants are getting their questions in, I just want to ask a question, Julie, around sort of the impact of extreme events versus just the level of variability that we're seeing in temperature and precipitation, both seasonally and year to year, and how complex that's making like the trying to understand or sort of untangle what impacts these weather events are having on pollinator and pest populations. So, for example, last year we had the heat dome in June, and then you have this extreme flooding in November, and now we're in a cold, wet spring. And so does that make it very challenging to tease out what the impacts are of the single event, because we're just, year to year, it's very different. So that seems like it would be a challenge. So maybe you could just speak to that, sort of the changes that you're seeing overall, and how you're trying to understand the impacts of these specific changes, since each year is very different in terms of weather.
Yeah, Shauna, that's a great question. And it's really beyond the scope of what I presented today. I think asking those sorts of questions about long-term population dynamics based on, changing climate and changing weather events, like it requires statistical modeling. And so I kind of presented like these snapshots before and after the heat dome. With enough examples, you can definitely make conclusions like, some are increasing, some are decreasing. But yeah, we're really interested in trying to understand statistically, based on that variation across years, whether we're seeing a heat dome signature or not. And so there's a working group at UBC who's compiling data from multiple different systems. Ours is in agriculture, but there may be some in fisheries and things like that, to develop models to detect those kind of extreme weather signatures on populations. The other thing is that for some insects, it's really important, like there are key things that happen. So we know for spotted wing, like freezing days are really important. So if you can kind of distill it into these key events, like has there been a freezing day? Has there been prolonged days of freezing? Then you can say something about how much the population is going to be knocked back. I don't think we don't have that for flooding. I don't think we have that for extreme heat yet. And so part of it is taking these observational data combined with experimental lab studies to try to get to those kind of threshold events beyond just low temperature. So we also get to the high temperatures, and then the variability is a whole nother aspect. So trying to experimentally manipulate variability to see how that influences populations in general is a very challenging thing to do.
Yeah, and I could definitely appreciate that, because the heat dome and the flooding, these are very new events. So trying to figure out what that means and what the impacts are. This is sort of all new research that David Grillo made this point earlier, that people never thought that they'd have to worry about this in the Pacific Northwest. But here we are, and we do expect it to continue to have some of these types of extremes. So yeah, I appreciate that this is kind of a new area of study, which to your point means more monitoring and needing those bigger data sets for statistical analysis. So on the point of monitoring, we do have a question here around what type of sites are you looking for the sticky pie? Are you looking for berry fields or wild sites or urban sites? And are there key insects that you're interested in tracking?
Yeah, that's a great question. And maybe I'll just address the monitoring. Like if everybody could just monitor more than what they're doing and keep long-term data sets, we would be so much more informed. It's really hard to fund long-term monitoring. And certainly the monitoring we're doing at UBC Farm, we're going out there every single week. It's only possible because we have students who are supporting the research. But we never did that monitoring thinking, oh, in 4 years, there'll be a heat dome and we'll be able to look at the effects, right? It's more just to, have that long range view at some point to see, how the populations are changing over time. One of the reasons we've created Sticky Pie is because it takes so much time to monitor those insects. And so this is a way that, the postdoc who's leading the project, Dr. Quentin Geisman, has really created this nifty tool that can identify a lot of the insects for us. It is focused on key insects and berries, so it's really good at identifying spotted wing. It's pretty good at identifying strawberry blossom weevil. It's not yet, so you have to train the algorithm, the machine learning, to identify the types of insects you want it to identify. So right now we're looking for berry fields to put it in because that's what we've trained it for. We're in the process of training it for more generalized insect data sets and creating a web app where anybody can take a picture of a sticky card from their field, upload the image, and we're going to work to try to identify insects on that image so that we have a more universal insect detector rather than one that's specific for berries. But yeah, for this year, we're looking for berry fields primarily.
That's great. And it looks like you already have a volunteer for a berry field. So you've done some recruitment through this presentation, which is excellent. Yeah, and I will include your contact info when we follow up after the webinar, so people will know how to get in touch with you if they would like to also participate in this. It sounds like a great opportunity for growers because you're also getting to get some additional monitoring in your fields, and it would be really interesting. Will there be a chance for participating growers to get the data from their local fields, or is it going to a centralized system? Yeah, so there's an opportunity there for data. Great. Do we have other questions? Feel free to pop them in there. I do have to ask you a question because I see that your grad student wrote in the chat, watch out for aphids in the future. Do you mind to just speak to that for a second?
I think that was
warning.
That was Jimmy who was talking about the aphids who, particularly with the CO2 increases in atmospheric CO2, aphids seem to be doing really well. Aphids are aphids. We have to watch out for aphids now. We have to watch out for aphids in the future. Like they're always going to be a problem. Yeah, Eric.
Jimmy seems to be concerned about aphids. You showed us a picture of floating ants and floating spiders, which that has me much more concerned, I got to say.
Yeah, we don't have the red invasive fire ant here. We do have European fire ants, but I don't know that they're that much of a problem in the fields.
I just mean in terms of being able to sleep at night. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, those photos were absolutely terrifying, the floating fire ants and the spiders. So I guess we have a few things to look forward to that we're not dealing with yet, but hopefully we won't get there. Okay, well, this is the last call for questions. I just want to say thank you to all of our presenters for joining us today. It's been a really informative few hours. And also thanks to all of you who joined. Many of you stuck with us throughout the full 3 hours, so thank you. I know it's quite a lot of time, but really some great information. And as I've already said, it's really great to just how responsive the research has been. These events have just happened, under the last 12 months, and getting this immediate information of what those impacts are is really, really helpful. So again, as I mentioned before, we have recorded everything. I will be sharing the recordings with all of the registrants. They'll also be posted on the Agricultural Climate Adaptation Research Network website, which is bcacarn.com, and on our YouTube channel. So you'll be able to access them. You'll be able to share them with your networks. And I encourage you, if you're joining from an organization or an agency, feel free to share those far and wide with your members or other networks. We're happy for you to do that. And yeah, so just like a final huge thank you to everyone. And we hope to see you at a future event.